Greetings, class. Welcome to our discussion of the final week of Jesus' ministry. The Gospels place a very large focus. The majority of their content is focused in on this last part of Jesus' ministry, both his teachings of his disciples in Jerusalem that final week and in preparation for it, his conflict with his enemies and opposition, and how he deals with them that final week, his trials, his arrest, his death, and his resurrection. This seems to be the heart of the gospel message. Everything that we studied before these moments leads up to the significance of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And without belief or without acceptance that these events occurred, the rest of the Gospels really don't make much sense, as I'm sure some of you have discovered, especially if you're not optimistic about the testimony that is given in the Bible. And if you are, then as we deal with the resurrection of Christ, we see how much of a celebration moment it is and how it brings the rest of the gospel message, the rest of the Old Testament, and the remaining books in the New Testament, how that death and resurrection of Christ brings all of those things into sharper focus. And in fact, they all make sense and come together in this very decisive moment. So the discussion of the final week of Jesus, and the preparation of his disciples for his death, and then his ultimate death and resurrection. Really, it's the heart of the Christian religion, and it is the heart of really the Bible as we can understand it. Without those moments, the Bible doesn't make any sense really at all. So with that in mind, we want to progress in our studies and our notes and just look over some key ideas as we see them in terms of Jesus' death and resurrection. Again, note the date of the end of his ministry. Somewhere between 30 and 33 AD. There's details in your notes about how we come to those conclusions, but just keep in mind the general date that goes with the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Secondly, note that as his disciples recognized his person as being more than just a regular rabbi, but he was a Messiah, a teacher of God, even the Son of God, as Peter frames it. That from that moment on, Jesus resolutely turns his attention to Jerusalem and the work that he's going to have to do there on the cross. And with his focus sharply there, he begins to prepare his disciples for that moment when he will be betrayed, when he will die. And he keeps telling them he will come back to life. The disciples, they don't think this way about a Messiah. They don't expect the Son of God to ever die. It doesn't make sense to them. And so when the events begin to unfold, the disciples and other followers of Jesus are truly confused. But Jesus himself is very clearly aware of what is taking place. And the Gospels pretty much present him as being very much in control of the process as it moves forward. Now, as we think about his time in Jerusalem, there's some key images you want to keep in mind. First of all, there's the triumphal entry, that time when Jesus, on a Sunday morning or afternoon, enters into the city, and the people are so excited to see him. They've heard rumors of his great miracles and are excited to see what he will do next as the festival of the Passover continues. There's probably even rumors that he's come to Jerusalem and is going to do something very special in terms of the politics of the situation, in terms of Roman control, and maybe begin a new kingdom. And so there are folks who are hoping for military change. There are folks who are hoping for outright rebellion. And as Jesus begins to enter the city, there are folks who sing songs for him that proclaim him to be king, basically. And as you might imagine, those in current power were not amused by this at all, especially the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They were very fearful of what the Romans might do if they saw the people respond to Jesus in this way. So the seeds of anger, the seeds of opposition, even thoughts about murdering Jesus and getting rid of his influence, these begin to grow into a crescendo until arrangements are made with one of Jesus' followers named Judas to betray him in a very quiet manner so that the leadership wouldn't have to deal with crowds turning on them. Because his popularity is soaring at this moment as he enters Jerusalem. And the Jewish leaders are very, very much afraid of what he might be able to do if people continue to follow him. Now, before they set out to betray him and find a way to murder him, they seek to discredit him. They do this primarily by confronting him among the crowds in the temple area. So as Jesus moves from this triumphal entry moment, he moves into the temple I'm sure that people were beginning to follow him and see what he would do, and the enemies of Jesus were beginning to plot against him, how they might overthrow him. But before anybody can say anything, Jesus beats them to the punch. He cleanses the temple. He turns over tables. He highlights the fact that there's injustice taking place. He calls for social justice. He calls for the authorities to look kindly on the masses. And he calls for social change, so much so that it completely and utterly irritates the leadership that is there. And they ask him, by what authority are you trying to accomplish all these things? And it's clear that Jesus is claiming an authority beyond them. So the Pharisees become very much aware that either they have to discredit him in front of the people, or the people are going to follow him to the point where there's going to be no controlling the situation, and irreparable harm will be done to the city, to the temple, to everything, if Jesus is not stopped. Now, Jesus is also aware of the harm that can come. And the way he plays his hand, if you will, during the final week also shows compassion for the crowds. He's not desiring that any of the crowds be harmed, and he, in terms of the confrontation, deals with his opponents without enabling the crowd to become violent, or without bringing the crowd to a point where they're going to side with him in terms of military involvement or violence in any way, shape, or form, even rebellion. And it's pretty clear that Jesus begins to set himself apart from everyone through this process in this final week. And so we see that he comes in. His first move is to enter the city. He does it very publicly. His second move then is to cleanse the temple and proclaim injustice, which the people are very, very accepting of. And then the third thing he does is he teaches his disciples, and he's taking them through this whole week, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. They're walking through the temple, and Jesus is teaching them. And it's at this point that the Pharisees decide to discredit him. So they take time and opportunity to ask him very difficult questions that have tricked other rabbis in the past in an effort to discredit him in the present. And so as you look through your notes, note some of the questions they asked, note some of the attacks that they made, note the very Jewish nature of the appeals and the arguments, and also note how Jesus answers better than anyone could have done in terms of their questions. He solved all of their riddles. He took all of their opposition, turned it on its head, and by the end of Tuesday, everyone who would seek to discredit him as a rabbi and a teacher, anyone who would seek to turn the crowds against him in terms of his love of God and his knowledge of the Scripture, had utterly failed. And Jesus himself comes out looking like the smartest rabbi in town, which only makes matters worse for the leadership and ultimately for Jesus. But again, Jesus is not shying away from the conflict. He's embracing it, and in fact knows that this is the ultimate end of the mission that he's on. Continuing forward then, he begins to minister more to his disciples, and Wednesday we don't have much information about what takes place. But on Thursday, we find that Jesus has set aside a very private room where he and his disciples can come together and share a Passover meal together. And in the setting of this very traditional and very religious statement, this meal, this Passover meal, a very religious statement about who the Jewish people are and how God has redeemed them out of Egypt, Jesus takes this meal and transforms it into an expression of how he intends to save not just the Jews, but the whole world from oppression and sin by his body and his blood. And thus, the birth of the Lord's Supper occurs as Jesus reinvents, if you will, the Jewish Old Testament meal of the Passover, not trying to empty it of its meaning for the Jewish people, but simply trying to indicate that he is fulfilling that meaning and more with what is about to happen with his death and resurrection. So as they share this meal together on the Thursday night, it becomes apparent that not everybody shares Jesus' vision of what the future can be for the Jewish people. Judas himself has already made plans to betray Jesus and sets those things into motion. Peter stands up in the middle of the meal and says, this is not going to happen. You're not going to die. You can't, we're not going to let you suffer. Your body and your blood will not be spilled. And Jesus rebukes him and says, this is the way it must go. And pretty soon, confusion begins to reign, and the whole thing that seemed to be leading up to some kind of marvelous crescendo begins to fall apart piece by piece. Jesus encourages his followers to go out out of the city. They cross over into the Mount of Olives, where Jesus begins to pray. We find here Jesus tested. He calls his disciples to pray as they are tested in a different way than he is. But everybody experiences testing. And Jesus is tested to take the easy way out. Again, Do you want to take the cup of wrath and death, or do you want to find another way? Jesus, within his human body, with human suffering fully in his vision, clearly chooses to suffer in order to accomplish the plan of God. And as he makes that choice, it becomes clear that the elements are in place. He's arrested, betrayed, and taken into court by the Sanhedrin as they determine what they need to do with him. Now, the Sanhedrin are trying to do this in a very secret way. They remove him to the high priest's house in order to get him away from the crowds and find a way again to discredit him legally without perhaps killing him, but with murder definitely on their mind. Matter of fact, the accusations of blasphemy would lead directly to stoning. So it's clear that even though they want to do it quietly, they want to do it permanently as well. The leaders want to get rid of Jesus once and for all. As the night progresses, it becomes clear that if a capital punishment is going to occur, and they want it to do so, that they're having trouble gathering witnesses, they're having trouble putting all the information together in order to make a legal decision, and they're going to have to present a case to Pilate in the morning. So as they work throughout the night in order to find a way to accuse Jesus, their accusations, they develop over time. There's not one accusation totally, but there's several that are made. They finally decide on the accusation of blasphemy and threats against the temple. They declare this to be worthy of death. And as the process goes along, anybody as an objective reader from the outside would say that this process, as recorded, is a mockery of justice. And in fact, is taking an innocent man and condemning him to death for no good reason. And we've seen as the story has developed that Jesus is definitely presented as one who was innocent in this process, one who did nothing to bring about the death of any innocent people, and in fact has gotten to a point where he allowed himself to be isolated away from his followers and from the crowds so that no one might be hurt but him. That's part of the plan. It is only he who can do this work. But so as we look at the trials, it becomes clear that the way they're organized and written, that they are an apologetic, a defense of Jesus, and that anyone who would say he was tried in a court of law, he was condemned to death on a cross, he's cursed, no one should believe in him. These testimonies reveal that in fact the mockery of justice should be recognized, and that Jesus was condemned unrighteously, and in fact he was not one who was cursed, but did it of his own accord and did it voluntarily to cover the sins of those who might believe. And so you can see how the theological aspects of the understanding of Christ and his death are very much represented in the way the trials are given to us in terms of what the Sanhedrin did and what Pilate did. Now, there are several elements of the trials themselves. I think you'll see that there are only two real trials here, the Sanhedrin's condemnation and then Pilate's condemnation. But note the trials that are listed there in your notes. Kind of see how the accusations develop as we go. And note then Pilate's final statement of, I don't want anything to do with him, I can't help him, he is condemned to die, and how the crowds cheer that. So the crowds that were praising Jesus not more than a week before, just on Sunday, now by Friday morning were condemning him to death and calling out for him to be crucified. So it was that on that Friday morning he was taken, he was beaten, placed on a cross, nailed there, and we see the significance of the cross in terms of what it meant for the Jewish thought processes as they saw a man cursed hanging from a tree. We see it also from the disciples' thought processes, those who were followers of him, and how his death actually became that element by which we are redeemed and saved. So some people view it as a curse, some people view it as the end, some people view it as a new beginning. And the significance of the cross can't be underestimated as we see how it plays out within the bounds of the story. I also noted how Jesus behaved on the cross. I've highlighted 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross. It's interesting to me to see how the different Gospels view Jesus' behavior in a variety of ways on the cross. Some very much in suffering, some very much in control, and some very much in a manner of mercy and forgiveness. And these various presentations come to us not in conflict, but in complementary ways, giving us a full image of Jesus on the cross. We see some Old Testament ideas and passages fulfilled. Again, part of the key aspect of the testimony of Jesus on the cross is how his death fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament from as much as 1,000 years prior to his coming. Now, as we consider the crucifixion, one of the questions we need to deal with is this: did Jesus really die? Was he really crucified? And there are several modern theories that try to explain away the death of Jesus. There's a modalist theory, in which case people just look at Jesus as a minister and said, yes, God was on him at one point, but God removed his spirit towards the end. And when he was on the cross, God was nowhere to be found, and Jesus died as a man. And so his mode had changed from divinely blessed to simply human who had died. And thus the modalist theory argues that Jesus, as God, never died, and that Jesus himself was never resurrected. We also see that there's a substitute theory as well, where there's a suggestion that Jesus had a substitute, that somewhere along the way on the journey to the cross, Jesus was whisked away by his disciples, and a willing substitute was placed on the cross, and that man died, and that man took the beating, and that man was never seen again, but Jesus was later brought back out and presented as having been resurrected, and the people followed him based on a lie and a forgery. Others suggest a swoon theory, where Jesus simply fainted on the cross and was revived in the tomb. And some suggest a stolen body theory, where Jesus did die, was buried, and that his disciples overcame the guards who were sent to protect him, moved the stone away, and stole Jesus' body, and then lied about his resurrection. So there are several ways that people try to deal with this. I would encourage you to take a look at these different theories, and as we discuss them online this week, give me your opinions. Do they sound valid? Which one of these sounds most valid? Or if you don't like the theories, why? What is it about the theories that does not make sense to you, and how would you give evidence to support your thought process? So again, we'll look at these various excuses. I do want to make observation in the notes that the crucifixion has some validity to it. There's a reason why he was crucified, and then there's reason to think that he was dead and in the grave, and there's also valid evidence to see that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. Now, let's be honest, the evidence we have comes from eyewitness accounts. The heart of the issue here is, do you trust the eyewitness accounts? If you don't trust the eyewitness accounts, there's no way that I could even suggest or make you believe what they say about Jesus. If you trust the eyewitness accounts, then it's not a very difficult step at all to accept the story as it's been presented to us. So again, your presuppositions definitely guide where your conclusions rest. As we continue on the process, note again the resurrection elements and the slide and the details on that. And then we end with what we call the ascension of Jesus. 40 days after his resurrection, he is elevated back up into heaven at the right side of the Father, where he continues today doing work for his people while the Spirit dwells among us. Now that is the theological description of it. But we want to see the transition here from Jesus' resurrection to the Great Commission, and how this launches the church into the next phase of ministry and the expansion of the Christian religion itself from a core group of people in Jerusalem to every major city between Jerusalem and Rome, and in fact within Rome itself as a growing movement by 60 AD, within one generation, all of the elements being in place culturally, linguistically, and even faith-based elements, so that the gospel of Jesus Christ can progress from Jerusalem to Rome. It's a fascinating process, and it's the death and resurrection of Christ that launches that momentum into reality. So I look forward to our continued discussion, and I hope that our overview here of our notes will give you some motivation to check out the elements of Jesus' arrest, the trials, his death, and his resurrection, and how these elements can be debated, and where you see proof, where you see reality here, and how this reality affects us. How does this change our ethics? How does the actions of Jesus portrayed in these stories cause us to want to be better people? And is there anything in these elements that can help transform society and make it a better place? As we think about how these stories impact us, I look forward to our discussion online. And thank you for your participation in the class. God bless.